The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 23.
The battle raged all around him, but without him. He could hear the agony of his friends as they were struck down. If he could only move, he might be able to tilt the balance and win the day.
Fergus, there must be another way.
Dan cried out to the great seer. Fergus looked into his eyes without a response as he was struck down. Fergus's eyes were fearful, but accepting. As they perished one by one, Dan looked on powerlessly, unable to move his body. Like any seed, Dan was planted and was stuck into the ground like a ball, his arms and legs covered in clay, totally immobilized. The forces of evil stomped and tore at his friends in satisfied laughter as he sank further into the muddy depths. When his face was finally submerged beneath the thick clay, he could no longer breathe. It was then he tried to use all of his strength to free himself from suffocation. Now he could not move or breathe. He was fated to drown into the underworld. It had been his choice to do so, but before his gods could claim him, he felt the rush of water on his face, and he awakened. Dan coughed and wheezed. His mouth and nose were filled with mucus, an after effect caused by the dark elf sleep poison. The bucket of filthy water that had been thrust onto his face liquefied his air passages momentarily, allowing him to gasp for a near-dying last breath. He opened his eyes. Dan's head pounded, and his stinging eyes were blood red. His vision was blurred. The poison, a drug the drow called viraf, or spider's bite, nauseated its victims intensely after the effects of the paralytic sleep wore down. Dan held among the sturdiest of human constitutions, but the dosage was so great that it nearly killed him. The drow males that captured him were astonished he was still alive. He was chained on his knees to the rocky floor of his subterranean cell. This held his chest and shoulders forward most uncomfortably, pinned to his folded legs. He could hear shadowy voices speaking in an unknown language around him. "He lives. May I tell the High Priestess? She will be most pleased," is what one of the silky voices said. Dan's matted hair was then pulled violently, and his head snapped back as far as his bindings would allow. He focused his blurry vision momentarily and saw the face of a dark elf male. His face was blacker than that of the fire giants, bespeaking a 400-year lifetime totally devoid of any contact with sunlight. His white hair was braided intricately, infused with many effeminate adornments by human standards. The drow male looked angrily at Dan's confused, swollen face, offering only disdain. "Disgusting. Why did she want this one?" asked Dalish, the head of the Zistiri clan's personal guard, in a yet unintelligible dialect. He then released Dan's hair angrily, as you might discard an unwanted apple core after it had caused you to bite your own lip. Dan's head fell to the hard, rocky floor. After the impact, his head spun, and then he vomited again. After that, his face was once more buried in a muddy, bubbly puddle of puke. Dan struggled for air until another bucket of filthy water was thrust violently upon his face. He then gasped for another breath. "Prepare it. Clean it up. Get it dressed," Dalish commanded. Dan had very little recollection of time. It may have been hours, days, or perhaps weeks since his capture. He was unsure. He was heavily drugged and could never remember much about his first few days of imprisonment. He did remember the first time he was brought before the fire giant king. It was also the first time he laid eyes on Kaylee's Zistiri. His head was still swollen from the cumulative effect of the many sedatives and other hallucinogens he had been given. It was a steady diet of disorientation, both mental and physical. This was all designed to prevent him from being any kind of beacon for any of his allies, including me. It's hard to find someone through augury, telepathy, or otherwise who doesn't know who, let alone where they are. By the time he was brought upstairs, Dan had nearly forgotten the life he used to live. A legion of armored drow males led him in chains to an immense banquet hall. It was more than twice the size and height of the Great Hall of Torbana. He was pushed into a small hanging cage where he remained for the duration of the king's banquet. He wore a simple ragged tunic cover, not unlike the one Welky wore upon his arrival in Voss. Dan was looked upon with curiosity by the fire giant females and children who inspected him, away from the main feasting table. As Dan's vision improved, he witnessed the many humanoid slaves who ran about their duties throughout the hall most pathetically. They served their giant masters, all while being prodded, slapped, and humiliated. The essence of total superiority was very important for these fire giants. Dan fell asleep against the bars of the little display cage he was in the midst of the cacophonous hall of the fire giant king. He dreamt in flashes of the Allfather and Tyr hurling thunderbolts and clamoring for revenge. An eagle unfurling its wings, free and in flight. Dan remembered having the strange feeling of freedom for the first time in a very long time, just prior to being startled back to consciousness by his keeper's baton, made of petrified wood. Dan was then dragged out of the cage and brought to his knees at the feet of the throne of the fire giant king. His drow keeper maintained a leash attached to his neck. His legs and arms were unbound, but he was still weak and disorientated from the many toxins. Dan no longer wielded the ancient giant-slaying sword, nor wore the girdle of giant strength. He was stripped down and filthy, prostrated before the king as a pathetic and weak hero among the tiny men. The fire giant king sat atop the massive ancient throne of the giants. On this throne sat the king of giants for many millennia before today, before the elves and dwarves were enslaved and then freed, before the orcs were unleashed upon them, and before the arrival and rapid spread of the meddling scourge of humankind. It was the seat of ultimate power in this world, and its occupant was praised long before humans had begun recording their history. The throne had been moved many times, with each passing century, as the giants' lands were further usurped by mankind. The throne was relocated further and further south and west, until finally it was placed here to stay, at Zytefetin, at the edge of the world. Its placement here made the fire giant king Zerlus master of all the world, at least from the giant's perspective. Zerlus was unarmed, with the exception of a freshly carved red dragon's hide he wore proudly across his body, like a sash. Dan heard another man grunting as he was thrown to his knees beside him. He looked over to see it was Reg, his most pious comrade in arms. The paladin looked over to Dan. He was beaten badly. He too had been drugged.
Dan, don't tell them anything. Be strong. Never break,
said Reg. His swollen face was scarred with many tiny cuts. It appeared they had gotten to him first. Dan looked up towards the dais on which the throne sat. To his left, he could see a shadowy figure, a drow female, observing the scene patiently from a raised platform. Then the fire giant king spoke in a language neither human could understand.
Which one? Which one destroyed my pet?
The massive king demanded, as he petted his wide black palms upon the freshly cut dragon hide, which was draped about his massive body. His head turned to his right, to the beautiful female drow seated nearby him. She was adorned in jewelry and brilliant dark armor. Her eyes were transfixed on the human prisoners. Dan's eyes met hers, and she grinned at him maliciously. In her hands was a small stick, which she spun in circles with great dexterity through her fingers, back and forth. She did this until she stopped and pointed the tiny stick at Reg. "That one," said the immaculate Drow High Priestess in a language foreign to Dan and Reg. "He is of no use to me. Do with him what you wish," she answered to the Giant King. With that, the Fire Giant King stood up from his throne and stomped 3 deliberate steps in the direction of Reg, who stared defiantly at the Giant King from his knees. His face was still scarred from the talons of Jarmia, which he survived due to the strength of his mighty steel battle helm. But he had no helm on his head now. The Fire Giant King reached his massive black hands around Reg's skull. He stared at him for a moment with pure contempt, and then he squeezed with all his might, squashing his head like an egg. Reg's bloodied headless stump fell before Dan's feet. Dan's face had been spattered with his friend's blood, but he looked on without emotion or words. The Giant King laughed as he wiped Reg's brain matter from his hands. He stuffed his fingers into a nearby lamp of burning wood and cinders, cleaning the human flesh and blood with the aid of fire and black ash. Then he approached Dan next. He pointed his ashy finger at Dan's swollen face.
This is the one who killed my warden. The one who came with the dwarves to free Khazustan. After we had just finished dining on his purple flesh.
The king's court erupted in heinous laughter, which filled the room.
I will squash his head as well.
The Giant King's voice thundered throughout his hall. His trusted guardsmen cheered loudly in support. It appeared then that Dan's days on this world were about to end. Somehow, both he and the Great Seer must have misread the portents. There would be no vengeance or path to final victory. He closed his eyes and readied himself to meet his gods. "Not this one. He is mine," spoke the Drow High Priestess pointedly. Dan was unsure what the Dark Elf said, but Zerlus yelled out defiantly to his guardsmen. His men bellowed out in equal displeasure, much in the same manner as the court of Bishop's Gate had done, after Fergus made his demand for clemency to Peltavor. The beautiful Dark Elf was unfazed. She started spinning the stick throughout her fingers again, staring at Dan with a wry smile.
Then take him from my sight. If I see this puny human again, I will smash his tiny head and turn his flesh into a minced meat.
Decried the Giant King, much in the same way Peltavor had done 12 years ago.
Dice this one up. We will eat him, since they destroyed our flock.
The king pointed at Reg's lifeless, bloody stump. Many of the humanoid captives went right to work, cleaning up the scene and preparing the great paladin into another meal fit for giants. The giants were still confused about who had invaded their subterranean lair, or who had perpetrated the attacks at the Golden Plateau and along the road there. King Zerlus believed we were agents of Quell. Kaylee Zistiri, the Drow High Priestess, knew better, but she kept that truth to herself. Dan was hurried away by his Dark Elf captors. They returned him to a small cell, where he remained for several days alone. Later, he was moved to a larger and more open cage. He could then sleep properly and upon a much softer surface. He was cleaned by the Drow and given more edible food and fewer intoxicants. Dan was able to dream again. Dan saw a bright, warming light opposite him. In its silhouette, the face of Fergus became visible.
I need to get out of here. When are you coming for me?
asked Dan. Fergus smiled at Dan and offered him words of comfort.
I cannot, for I am no longer of this world,
answered the great seer.
Yet you are still. You must fulfill your destiny. How can I? I am a lone warrior, and I have been stripped of my weapons. Be patient, Dan. Remember, only you were capable among us. No one else could achieve this. But now I am captured. How can I achieve anything? What must I do?
Dan asked. Even in his dreams, he was becoming more cogent.
Are we lost? Have all my comrades fallen? You are alone now. Do what you must. The way will be shown.
Dan was overcome with sadness. Any uncertainty over the fate of his comrades was now just a tale of tragedy. Like all others before us, we were just another failed mission into the jagged cliffs. Dan awoke to find the young drow female, Ilka, in his cell with a bowl of food in her hands. Her presence startled him.
You eat,
she said in the human common tongue, motioning to her mouth. Dan's appetite had indeed returned, despite the unpleasant nature of the food. Fried insects, mushrooms, and pickled root grass. He ate it all. Ilka stayed with him, observing him. Dan spoke to her as he ate, but she didn't seem to understand. She simply smiled at him in response to each of his words, no matter what it was he said. After he finished his meal, she moved closer to tend to his wounds with drow healing arts. At first, Dan was hesitant to allow her to touch him.
This help you,
she said, smiling. She rubbed a lotion of healing on his neck and chest most sensually. All of the little holes where he had been shot by darts were filled with the drow healing lotion. Dan remembered what Fergus had said, both in his most recent dream and in their meetings many months before. The vision they shared was deemed an opportunity the gods had afforded them. It was unlike any other vision before it, because they shared it, and it involved the All-Father. Dan was the key, for only he was suited to succeed. Only he could be that bright, floating bubble that Fergus witnessed in the dark sea bottom of hell, eluding the grasp of the great demon. Ilka's hands were soft, and her face was pleasant. Dan started to feel aroused by her touch. As strange as these drow elves looked and smelled, it had been a while since he had been sexually active. At that moment, Dan could imagine Reg's resistance to any such assistance from these dark elves. His refusal and persistent religious fight would have made him totally unsuited to be a prized prisoner living among them, something they coveted greatly. It was a sign of tremendous power to hold powerful captives. So Dan allowed Ilka to touch him. The more she touched him, the less he resisted, and the more pleasure he allowed himself to feel. Later, when Dan allowed Ilka to stimulate him sexually, the drow initiate reported this news back to her high priestess immediately. Over the next few days, Dan's energy returned. With his health restored, he took ever greater sexual interest in Ilka and the other female acolytes that came to see him. There were 3 other drow females that she invited, to whom she was displaying Dan's impressive body. They toyed with him until he grew frustrated. He then mounted one of the older, heavier-set drow. He grabbed her and forced her down onto his bed while the others watched and laughed. It was then the high priestess made her presence known, as well as her claim to Dan. "Leave us," said Kaylee to her underlings. The stocky drow looked back to Dan with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. Males in their culture never initiated sex. That was the female's place. and it would be a tremendous embarrassment among her kind to have been manhandled like she had been. But she wanted him badly, and was disappointed she could not feel his tremendous size inside her. Dan was taller than most human men, and was physically gifted as well. The drow were elves, and the males were generally smaller than the females. His presence to them was a complete sexual contradiction. His giant-killing, human fighting power was awesome. His remarkable human beauty, equally unexpected. He was unlike any human man they had ever seen. Kaylee's trusted brother Dalish locked in on Dan with eyes meaning to kill. As the 4 drow neophytes scattered out of the cell, Kaylee Zastiri entered. She was unarmed. Unlike the others, her skin was lighter, with a subtle hue of dark purple, because unlike these others, her skin had felt the light of day on several occasions. Also, unlike the others, her face was perfection. Her physical beauty was truly astonishing. Her body was completely symmetrical, with all of the necessary traits of female attractiveness. She was a complete match, in terms of pure charisma, to that of Dan. Kaylee's pale eyes took in Dan's equally beautiful face and body, studying his face for insights into his mind. His countenance was merely that of acceptance. He stood upright, with his large naked body there for the taking, as she approached. She couldn't help but notice Dan was completely aroused. She offered a subtle smile before offering him a silken sheet with which to cover himself.
Kaylee,
Her brother Dalish called out for caution, but she then turned and scolded him in their ancient Drow dialect. Dalish then stepped back reluctantly. Dan covered himself, and then took a step back, sizing up the intruder for any weaknesses. "Who are you?" she asked in Dan's language. Her strange accent whispered out of her perfectly shaped lips.
My name is Dan Tenuviel. I am a giant killer.
Her eyes peaked with curiosity by his bold response. "I see that. Yes, you are. They tell me you made quick work of the warden. But you are not one of Quell's vassals. You did not come from Didak?" She waited for Dan to respond. He simply shook his head slowly. "Then why are you here, giant killer?"
To kill giants.
Dan responded smugly. Kaylee looked into Dan's eyes for a few expressionless moments until a devious smile cracked on her lips. Then she burst into laughter. "Yes, I imagine this would be the place to come, if you wanted to do that," she answered in her alluring accent, quite amused by Dan's beguiling natural charm. When her laughter subsided, she continued her interrogation. "But these dwarves, you followed them here?"
Yes,
said Dan.
they sought me out, promised me great treasures if I freed their brothers.
She looked dubious. "Just you, the dwarves, and the righteous paladin, whose head Zerlus snapped?"
That's right, just us.
Dan spoke softly as Kaylee closed in. "That was no peasant knight. If he could slay Jarmia." Her aroma was strange but inviting. Her presence totally unique to any woman Dan had ever encountered.
Yes, looking back on it, it was definitely a fool's errand. I told him that repeatedly. But you know how they get. Paladins.
Her eyes were locked in on Dan's. Though very tall and well-developed amongst other drow females, she was still more than a foot shorter than Dan was. So as her chest nearly met his, he towered over her. Dan kept his hands to his sides. His body was imposing, but her eyes held tremendous power and confidence. "You may be a great giant slayer, Dan Tenuviel, but you are a horrible liar." She then gave him a slight and sudden push with totally unexpected strength, knocking Dan back onto his floor bedding. Ramthar would have been very disappointed in him. As Dan began to get up, she motioned for him to remain there, on the floor, so she could now tower over him. Her impressive physique stood proudly before him.
Where is the priest?
I know that paladin did not come all this way to hobby hunt giants or to rescue some penniless dwarves. He was an elite knight. Where is his high priest, Dan? Or should I say, where is your high priest, Dan? Where are your mages? With each question, she made one step closer. Kaylee then got close enough for Dan to reach out and grab her wrists. In a single lightning-quick grappling move, he pulled her down to him while he spun, enabling him to flip and land atop her. He then had her pinned beneath him. She was strong, but even without his magic giant strength, Dan was much stronger. He held her down by her wrists, while she struggled to remove his grip. She was silent as she looked angrily into his eyes, for no man ever dared do what he was doing.
Now, let's talk about me getting out of here,
said Dan aggressively. Kaylee looked up at him with a mixture of surprise, anger, and excitement. She sneered and then showed off her own brand of wizardry, shocking Dan painfully through her wrist he grasped. She used the force of the magic electricity to flip and throw him to the other side of the cell. Dan stood up defensively, though he did not dare charge. She was a high priest, a mage, and a warrior. She was a living triumvirate in and of herself. Kaylee's guard came to the cell after hearing the commotion. She looked at Dan defiantly, but with a strange tinge of affection and newfound respect. Her instinct was to kill him. Instead, she smirked at him and then made her way out of the cell briskly. "There's others. Find them," she said, looking back at Dan one last time before she left, with a curious sense of anticipation. But over the next couple of days, Dan was not fed or offered palatable water. Instead, he was drugged, tied, and beaten fiercely. Dalish felt great delight in using his spiked whip on Dan's back. The following day, Ilka returned with food and then tended to his welted back. As she applied the healing lotion, she attempted to teach Dan a bit of manners.
You no touch the sisteri. You, the human, not the sisteri. You, unworthy,
she said again, trying to properly articulate the new words she had learned. She gave Dan another spoon filled with larvae. Dan's face had been beaten badly too. His lips could hardly open or close, so some of the maggots within the paste wiggled to freedom from his chapped lips.
Eyes.
She pointed to her eyes.
Down,
she said, motioning for the lowering of his head while in the presence of the house of Zestiri.
You live.
Ilka spoke many words in her own language out of frustration of her speech barrier, while she applied the healing ointment to his back wounds. He cringed as her fingers touched the many places where the brutal blows of Dalish's spiked whip had landed.
Dan, leave. You stay. You live.
She smiled at him, proud of the new words of human common tongue she had learned. She was the most playful and happiest of Drow Dan would ever meet.
She like you. Ilka, like you. You live.
She smiled. A few days later, Kaylee returned to Dan's cell. As the steel gate swung open, she entered with her brother, both heavily armed for battle. Several other drow were waiting like shadows in the wings. Dan sat up, but was still very sore, still recovering from the intense beating he took. "We've found them," Kaylee said, her eyes meeting Dan's most angrily.
Who have you found?
Dan asked innocently. "Your party. Your ship. We've found them," she answered slowly and matter-of-factly. When she said, "your ship," Dan was certain that the base had been compromised. But he wanted to see. He needed to see what he could see, and know what he could know.
Show me,
Dan said, his mouth still swollen from the multiple impacts of drow bucklers and fists. Kaylee stepped towards him and reached her arm in his direction. "Take my hand," she said. Dan reached out without hesitation and held her hand gently. Dan could hear Dalish yell in disbelief briefly before she and Dan were teleported to the base. They arrived by the riverbed just outside the mountain cavern. It was quiet. It was now getting colder at night, but it was mostly clear. Both moons were near full that evening. Dan realized where he was, turned, and grunted as he made a few pain-filled steps towards the cavern entrance. "You do know this place," she told, not asked. Dan could make out the pungent smell of corpses. It was a 2-week-old battlefield. It smelled of stagnant death.
Where are the bodies?
Dan demanded.
I want to see them.
He endured even more pain as he ran on the gravel with his broken feet in the direction of the cavern. When he reached the entrance, all of the illusory magic and disguises were gone. And there, aligned by someone and stripped of any valuables, were the rotting, headless corpses of Fergus, Khan, Theos, and Kiartan. Dan's heart swelled in anguish. He held back his emotions long enough to speak 3 more words.
This is it?
Dan asked. "Were there more?" Kaylee asked, like she already knew the answer. There was a long pause as the two stared each other down under the cool autumn double moonlight. Then Dan spoke first. His eyes welled with tears.
Yes.
Dan looked down as he answered. Kaylee nodded and turned. "Over here," she said. Dan followed behind her in agonizing pain. Each step he took hurt more than the last. Dalish had pounded his feet with a hammer. Kaylee made confident steps and then stopped. She pointed at Cain and then at Gladjusen Tai. "And another, over there." She pointed several yards ahead, where the body of Thon lay. Dan strode towards him, and then finally could withstand no more pain, and collapsed near his best friend. He cried out as Kaylee approached from behind. "This one, he was your brother?" she said politely.
Yes,
Dan said. Dan's pain turned into intense rage. He looked at the Drow priestess on his knees with contempt.
So go then. Do it. Finish me, or I swear by the wrath of Tyr, I'll snap your neck with my bare hands.
Dan threatened. "Your thirst for vengeance is refreshing, but it's pointed in the wrong direction, Dan Tunuvio. This attack came from Didok. My forces did not do this. We simply discovered the battlefield yesterday."
Quell did this?
Dan asked, taking in the scope and magnitude of the loss on this field. "Yes," Kaylee answered, her back turned to Dan. "He rules an army of interdimensional demons, and the most vicious of beasts. We all tire of his presence here, in these mountains. Didok must be destroyed," Kaylee said, which hummed in Dan's ears like a sweetly sung song. "But how do I know You're not soon to side with Quell. She turned towards him.
Quell's been trying to kill me since I was a boy. He killed my whole family. My own mother demanded vengeance be taken upon him. He's menaced my homeland and brought an army of undead upon it. Now he kills all of my friends, everything I love. And you expect me to turn to his side?
Kaylee turned away again, smiling at the song Dan now sung.
Allow me my revenge. Then you can kill me,
Dan said to her back. She turned her elegant face to Dan once again, with an impressed grin, and then approached. Will you serve me, Dan? Pledge your fealty to me, and to me alone? Will you worship me as your goddess, instead of your other gods? Do this, and yes, I will help you kill Quell. I will enable your revenge. Kaylee countered. Dan closed his eyes and hard swallowed the concept of fealty to evil. The white flame was now lost. His friends were all dead. He had seen all the bodies, except for mine, which, given the shared vision, kind of made sense. Dan looked up to Kaylee. Her luscious body and penetrating eyes waited patiently for his response.
Kaylee, if you can see, to my revenge.
With each word he spoke, Kaylee came closer.
Yes, I will serve you, defend you. I will kill for you, and I will love you,
Dan said, with all of his heart that remained on this darkest day of sorrow. He looked into Kaylee's eyes. Her beauty was pure pleasure to witness, and her attention was something far more precious. Yet somehow Dan managed to see behind and beyond her in periphery. There he saw the smiling visage of the great seer's face, filling the night sky. Kaylee came ever closer with her warm body. She extended her arms and laid healing hands on Dan's body. Her touch was beyond soothing. Her hands caressed his head and face gently, and the pain and swelling subsided. Her moist, supple lips met his, and he could suddenly feel his face again. Her delicate fingers embraced his back, and all of the welts of the whip vanished from his skin. And the lingering barrage of pain was quieted. She then massaged his feet, and they too were healed. Dan was warm all over, and he could stand again without pain. He sat up, and his face met hers. She then sat beside him in her tightly fitting battle armor and rested her healing hands on his knees. The moonlight caused her skin to glow ever more purplish. Dan had never felt such intense desire. Vengeance is the greatest of all the emotions, Kaylee professed. It is pure, unblemished by doubt. Knowing it is knowing truth. She moved ever closer to Dan as she spoke each word more softly. She brought her luscious face and glowing eyes opposite Dan's under the moonlit sky. I accept your offer, she told him. Then she stood, extending her hand out to him again. Dan could see it was very important for Kaylee to feel dominant and in control at all times. Dan obliged her, but as he lifted himself up, his eyes returned to the macabre scene before him. His friends, decimated, stripped of their valuables and left for the carry-on. Dan turned away from Kaylee and headed purposefully back towards his fallen comrades. Where are you going?
To bury them. These were great men, Kaylee. They cannot be left like this,
Dan demanded. As he turned to search for a spade or shovel in the cave, Kaylee's voice rang out again. I will see to it. Personally, they will be embalmed and buried per your human customs.
And Reg, his things, and the dwarves.
It will be done, Kaylee assured Dan. Come, take my hand. Let us see to your revenge. Dan turned back towards her, genuinely yearning deeply to feel her touch again. He looked back one last time to his fallen friends and whispered one of Fergus's short, after-battle prayers. Forgive us the many innocent lives lost, as we exact your will. He reached out to her, and she then teleported them back to her quarters, deep in the caverns of Zaitefetum. Almost immediately, nearly a dozen servants and acolytes entered the large, ornate room, arranging themselves in their prescribed positions, awaiting her commands. Dan was taken to a large bath with water heated by springs deep in the mountains. The water was hotter than any bath he had ever experienced. Some of the servants cleaned him as they would their high priestess. He then laid back in the healing water and nearly fell asleep.
You look very comfortable,
she said. Dan looked up to Kaylee as she disrobed, revealing her perfect naked body. She stepped into the large bath and descended underneath the water. When she emerged, she slipped her soft, supple body from Dan's feet all the way to his head, where her lips met his. Her body was warm. Dan did not have to ask for permission to begin. If it hadn't been their pact of vengeance that bound them, then it could be said Kaylee's proficiencies with her hands, tongue, and mouth were to blame. Her sexual prowess had enthralled Dan right then in that hot bath. Kaylee had lived nearly 835 years, and in that time, she had mastered all of the arts of pleasure. But her body was very petite by human standards, and when she climbed atop Dan, her dominance was tested immediately. Dan was more than 800 years younger than Kaylee, but in his short life, he had also learned much. Being inside her felt like something a man might never experience in 10,000 lifetimes. Soon Dan was atop her, and she allowed it, because she too was in ecstasy. All of her acolytes and servants could hear it. Dan stayed with Kaylee in her bedroom all night, and they had sex that could unlikely be bettered. After hours of intercourse, Dan actually fell asleep there in her bed. When he awoke, she was gone. But atop one of the bureaus in her bedroom was his entire battle kit. His giant slaying sword, his girdle of giant strength, his helmet with Guth's melted ear, and his armor, which had been repaired and refashioned. In terms of protection, mobility, and movement, it was greatly improved. Dan geared up immediately and readied himself for a showdown in Dedok. He hadn't held a weapon for over 2 weeks, and his restored giant strength made him feel powerful again. When Kaylee returned, Dan was swinging his weapon forcefully, whipping it through the air as he practiced the Promethean sword forms. Impressive. It's difficult to decide what impresses me most about you, Dan Tenuvio.
We've just met. Give it time.
Once again, he began the ancient forms Ramtha taught. Were you surprised to find all your things returned? Kaylee asked, stepping dangerously close to Dan's air-whipping sword range. Kaylee had just spent several painstaking hours delivering threats and fending off new Drow conspiracies, forming all around her. She was eager to resume the excellent lovemaking at once.
Did you expect me to fight in a loose tunic?
Dan's moves were precise. Kaylee had never seen human sword forms performed this way. He stopped and turned to her to say,
I would have.
He resumed. Dan was eager for battle. Are you surprised that I trust you? She asked. Dan then did a spinning defensive move with 3 fierce slices and jabs. He then turned masterfully and held his sword just before piercing Kaylee's exposed abdomen.
Yes. Why should you? What reason have I given you to trust me?
Dan asked, closing in with the point of his sword. Closer and closer. Until the point of his sword depressed her tight belly skin ever so slightly.
What's to stop me from getting my revenge right here, right now?
Dan asked, like a true warrior. Kaylee grasped the sword with both of her naked hands. She held it tighter, and she cut her fingers on the sharpened blade as she pulled it towards her. If you mean to kill me, then I do not want to live another day, she professed passionately. She then pulled the sword firmly into her belly. Dan pulled back on the blade, removing it from her grip, but then placing it in front of her face. She then put her mouth to the sword, as she had to him the night previous. Dan dropped the sword, and she leapt into his arms. This pairing was fate displayed truly, but for now, only in secret. Fate whisked through and above even the power of the gods, to consider that these two like opposites would ever meet, let alone find completion and absolution in each other. How strange fate's works do seem. Indeed, for Dan and Kaylee were made for each other, and together now they were.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and ring the bell for notifications so you don't miss an episode. Be sure to like and comment below. It helps a lot. If you'd like to help me get this book published, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. And as always, be sure to share this story with your friends on your favorite social media.